I think storytelling brings awareness, not only about the world around us, but an inner awareness. You can read a book or watch a film, and you can experience a life that you wouldn't normally experience, or someone's point of view, and you can have empathy for that point of view.
Welcome to Crazy Good Turns. This is the podcast that recognizes and celebrates people who do great things for others. And I'm your host, Frank Blake. Before we get started with our interview, I want to take a pause and share some reader mail. In response to our November episode, a listener named James Van Warner reached out and wrote, "Frank, I love your podcast. It's inspirational and a call to action. I often listen to a story and wonder how I could get involved in that cause. You asked for suggestions. Here is mine. There are so many crazy good turns that go unknown to a broad population, and I believe that adds to our society's negativity. If more people were exposed to how common kind acts really are, they might be moved to perform a kind act as well, or at least be more aware and feel some gratitude. I think a good addition to the podcast would be to read a few examples of gratitude from people who are on the receiving end of someone performing a kind deed, expecting nothing in return." Well, first, James, thank you for your letter. I wrote back to James, and I'll say it here to everyone. His words really made my day. It's great to get listener feedback like that. And second, I agree with him. Having these kinds of stories and hearing about them, it's uplifting, and there's something we should feature more of on the show. So in fact, to start things off, our team reached out to James and asked him for an example of the type of story he described, a time when he was on the receiving end of a kind deed from people who expected nothing in return. And here's what he said. "My pickup died right at an intersection. Not a typical intersection, a five-way intersection. Cars were stopped behind me. When they realized I was not moving, they just drove around. You can imagine some of the looks as if I had caused this on purpose. The only way to get my truck out of the way was a bit of an uphill push and turn into a parking lot. As people drove around, I tried to push and steer from the driver's door with little success. Then two guys show up and say, 'Hop in and steer.' They pushed the truck up into the parking lot, asked if I needed any other help, then hopped in their car and continued on. Oh, and did I mention it was raining?" Well, that's a terrific, crazy good turn to share, James. Thank you very much for it. And in the same spirit, I'm going to start off with a crazy good turn that I experienced, and then I'll open it to all listeners to send in examples of the kind of crazy good things someone did for you. And I hope you send your thoughts to us on Twitter or email them to us at hello@crazygoodturns, and we'll share your stories in future episodes of Crazy Good Turns. My story is the first thing that came to my mind on sharing a crazy good turn, and it's a bit of an odd one in the sense that it's not an actual act that the person did, but just the way the person handled, in this case, herself. And it goes way back to, I was early on in my job at Home Depot, and I would do dinner meetings with hourly associates. Typically, if I would go into an area in the country where there are Home Depot stores, we'd get a bunch of associates together and have dinner. It was just informal, how things going. It was a way for me to keep in touch with what was happening in the company. And one of the first ones I did, I'm sitting next to this woman about my age at the time, mid-50s, and we were having a nice conversation, and I started by complaining a little bit that I had a bad back. Now, mind you, it wasn't really that bad a back. I was sort of making conversation, and in any case, I had flown in on a company plane. I had nothing to complain about, but there I was complaining about my whinging back. And she said, "Yes, I've had back problems too." And I said, "Oh, really? What were they?" And she said, "Well, I fractured my spine, and I had to be constrained to a wheelchair for a while, and that made it very difficult working in the store in a wheelchair. And I'm sympathizing with her, the pain that she had with her back and having to work through that back pain, and I'm feeling smaller and smaller about my little complaint. And then she adds, but that's not the hardest part of it. The hardest part of it is then when I go home, I take care of my developmentally disabled son, and he's now 12 years old, and it's very difficult bathing him, and that's presented more challenges for me and frankly continues to hurt my back. And I felt even smaller listening to that. But she said it, and the reason why I'm mentioning this as a crazy good turn is she said it so matter-of-factly. She wasn't complaining. It was her life. She was actually full of joy. It's hard to capture how she had such a positive attitude. And to this day, it impresses upon me the fact that people around us are dealing with amazing things and difficult things and setting examples for us. And the examples they set are their own crazy good turns. And I think of, frankly, every parent in the country who goes home and is dealing with the difficulties of a disabled child, or a parent who's has dementia or other issues, and you realize the burdens people carry without complaint. Those are, in their own senses, crazy good turns. There was a wonderful line Henry Kissinger gave at the funeral of Senator John McCain. And he said, John McCain is a hero who inspired us with the matter-of-factness with which he treated his sacrifice. There are heroes all around us just like that. This woman was one of them. I always kept her example in mind, thinking about work and thinking about how it's ridiculous for someone like me to ever complain, and others bear such an amazing burden, and we ought to be so grateful for the grace with which they do it. So that's my crazy good turn that I would share with all of you. But I'd love it if you'd send in your thoughts from anything that you say this inspires you on the positive side about human nature, of people who either by themselves or through their actions to others set crazy good turns for us to follow. We'll share your stories in a future episode of Crazy Good Turns. And again, send them in either to us on Twitter or email them to us at hello@crazygoodturns.org. And now let's move on to the episode. I'm thrilled that we have Caroline Slaughter as a guest. Caroline is a terrifically creative person whom I've gotten to know because she reached out to give some advice on how we do the Crazy Good Turns podcast. She is herself a podcaster with a top 15 podcast in her resume. She's a writer, an actor, she's a producer. She's done just an amazing breadth of things. And during this interview, we're going to talk about some of her lessons learned about storytelling and about the generosity associated with storytelling, about some of the fascinating podcasts she has worked on, and one she is working on now about a man called Tom Slick, who I'd never heard of him, but a fascinating inventor, business person, and adventurer. I reached out to her for some advice, and she gave me wonderful advice. But in the process of giving me the advice, I also learned that she has a great heart for what we're doing on Crazy Good Turns, and she had some great comments about Crazy Good Turns. And so I thought, this is so terrific, I'm going to ask Caroline to join the show. So welcome, Caroline. It's great to have you on.
Thanks, Frank. It's great to be here. I mean, I do listen to the podcast, and you've interviewed so many influential, extraordinary, generous people. So it's an honor to be interviewed by you.
Terrific. Well, Caroline, again, for the audience's benefit, they should know you directed the award-winning short film Lamb, Lamb. You're involved with so many amazing podcasts, including podcasts with Andy Samberg, the SNL Saturday Night Live personality. And you've got Top 15 podcasts. But I also couldn't help noticing a quote in your Instagram bio that talked about turning heartbreak into action. And I just thought a good place to start would be, what does that mean to you?
You know, Lamb was a personal reaction to the Me Too movement that I had. And that reaction and that feeling that I had felt like heartbreak. And I was able to take that and create a film that ended up ultimately being a unifier for my all-female crew and for the people that saw it at the film festivals. And so I think what I mean by turn heartbreak into action is you can take something that might feel like pain and turn it into something that can unite people. And that's what I did with Lamb specifically.
Explain what you do as a storyteller, whether it's through film, podcast, whatever.
I'm a compulsively curious person. So like you, I'm so interested in why people do what they do, why they are who they are. And I think that has driven me towards storytelling. And a lot of my stories are character driven, which means that I start with humans first, and then I build the story from that. So I think that's sort of what led me to story, is that curiosity about others.
Tell me a little bit about Astray and the podcast Astray, because that seems like a great example of that.
Well, Astray was interesting. I was sort of put into the role of journalist in that one, and I was investigating the disappearance of 3 Westerners who went to India on these spiritual quests, seeking enlightenment. And so in Astray specifically, we were looking at the cost of enlightenment and how far people go for that sort of spiritual curiosity. I started with that story because I was so intrigued by what spirituality is and why people are so drawn to it and why it's a, $4.5 billion industry. And then we chose India because of these sort of disappearances. But I learned a lot through that because I was dealing with a lot of grief with like grieving parents, specifically. And I learned that these human stories are really, you have to be very careful telling other people's stories and relaying them to an audience.
Because the folks left behind will misunderstand? Because why do you have to be so careful?
Because people have a specific idea of how someone they loved lived their lives. People have ideas of the people that they love the most. And I think when you shed light on things that those loved ones might not want to see, or when you put things out in the world that might be hard for them to hear, that's hard because it sort of taints this idea of the person that they loved.
If you were to say, what were some of the learnings from that or from other stories that you've told? What have you learned about the narrative arc or how you can use stories to help people move through difficult times, get better, however you want to approach it?
I think story is, it's such an interesting thing. I think when you create stories like me, there's an awareness that comes out of them because I'm sort of relating to the story and putting myself into the story. For listeners of a podcast or watchers or viewers of a film, they get an awareness if there's something that sort of resonates with them in that story. But also, I think there's an empathy that comes from storytelling, from watching other stories, even if you don't understand them. Like, I didn't understand much about India when I was doing this story, and I was working with my co-producer over there, and they were going through COVID at the time. And so we really spoke about that. We were going through COVID as well, but they were going through that really difficult time that they had where there was not a lot of medicine or there was no vaccine for them. And so being able to sort of empathize with what they were going through while we were telling this story was very profound, and it was disturbing in some ways because I couldn't get over there and help. And I felt like I was telling the story about a place that was sort of in disarray, and there was no way for me to help over here.
When you reflect on it, are there stories that you think that you've started to tell, and in the telling of it, it's actually helped change you for the better?
I think all stories help change you for the better. I think a lot of times we come into storytelling thinking that a story will go one way and we try to control it. But if you allow a story to be what it's supposed to be, a lot of times it does end up changing you because it's sort of your own evolution as the storyteller. So I think all stories change me.
I'm curious, just as you're approaching a story and also very effective in, as I said at the start, in many different kinds of media, do you find yourself tempted to put a harsher edge on stories because that's what generates audience, make them a little more sensational, emphasize certain elements of it, or do you find a way to resist that temptation?
It's hard because a lot of the marketplace right now, especially in podcasts, as we all know, is a lot of true crime. And so I was specifically with Astray put into that niche. And for me, it was really difficult to try to sensationalize these stories, even though there was a lot of hype around them and they were already somewhat sensationalized by the media. It was hard for me to do that. So I tried to really bring experts in to understand the various facets that we were uncovering and to even discuss true crime in general, like why people are drawn to true crime and why women specifically are drawn to true crime.
Why are we drawn to true crime? Why would we rather listen to a true crime story than about a story about somebody who's done something great for others?
I think that women specifically are trying to prepare for something that might happen to them, like I think there's a little bit of that preparedness of like, I will know and control everything around me. So if this happens to me, I will know how to take care of it, or how to save myself. I think the sensational nature of true crime is an escapism that a lot of people were sort of looking for before the pandemic. I think when the pandemic hit, shows like Ted Lasso really blowed up because people want joy. I think people want more of that happiness. And, Tom Slick, the piece I'm doing with Andy Samberg, is about this tremendously influential man that no one's heard of. Incredible guy. It's a true story. He established 5 major research institutes. One of them developed the COVID vaccination. He hunted the Yeti for 5 years, and this is really fascinating. He ended up finding, and by hunting, I don't mean he actually was hunting the Yeti. He was trying he was very into mysticism, and he wanted to see if the Yeti was alive. And so he ended up finding a Yeti digit, like a finger, in a monastery like somewhere in the Himalayas. He ends up getting it to Kathmandu to Jimmy Stewart, and Jimmy Stewart ends up getting it over to London. His wife hides it in her underwear in her suitcase so no one will look for it. They get it to London. It goes to a scientist. He examines it. It's not a bear. It's not a human. No one knows what it is. And then the scientist dies. No joke. And the Yeti digit disappears. And so when no one knows where it is, it's very fascinating. That's sort of what we're doing the Tom Slick story on. But this man, he's amazing. He allegedly got the Dalai Lama out of Nepal to India. He wrote 2 books on world peace, and he created one of the first oral contraceptions because he was all about population control. So fascinating. So
what an amazing. So you're exploring this person's life.
That's right. And to answer your question, I'm getting out of true crime because I want to tell extraordinary stories. You and I bonded over generosity and goodness in the world, and I think we need more of those stories. So, yes, to answer your question, I'm getting out of the true crime realm and going into goodness.
So we did talk a lot about generosity, and you've said to me and to others that there's generosity in storytelling. What do you mean by that?
I think storytelling brings awareness, not only about the world around us, but an inner awareness. And, I think there are times when you leave a film or you finish reading a book and there's an element of that story that brings some sort of awareness to your own life. But I also think, like I said earlier, you can read a book or watch a film and you can experience a life that you wouldn't normally experience, or someone's point of view, and you can have empathy for that point of view, and you can connect to that point of view. And I think that's the generosity of storytelling, is that connection and that awareness of other people. And that's the unifier of storytelling. I think storytelling unites humanity, which is a pretty profound, bold statement, but I really do believe that, and I've seen it happen.
And my answer to that question is not at all dissimilar. I mean, stories are very much about sharing, and they're sharing perspectives, and the best storytellers are the ones who immerse you in another life. And through that process, I think you get a better understanding of others and a better sympathy, empathy, and it all starts with appreciation and recognizing that everyone is, someone who deserves our attention and gratitude in a way, and ultimately our generosity. The best stories really connect in that way, and whether they have the end point as a generous story or not, they connect in that way.
Do you feel like when you were at Home Depot that stories helped to unite the people that worked with you?
I do. I think I'm not a brain scientist, so I don't know how this works, but I think we remember stories long after we remember, stock phrases or, here's what we want you to do, or mission statements and all the rest. We remember stories. If you want to get someone to appreciate the experiences someone else has been through, stories are the best way to do that. It's not a polemical argument. It's an argument through example and experience. And stories can provide that. And I know certainly in my own life, the things that I most remember are stories. I, long since forgotten many spreadsheets, but I remember the stories of the people.
Do you feel like those letters that you would write people on Sundays that I've heard about in the podcast, those generosity letters, would you consider that a story?
Thank you notes that are powerful are thank you notes that are themselves specific and a bit of a story. So I give a great example because someone just thanked my wife for some present she sent them. If they had sent a note that said, thank you very much, your present was awesome, you're wonderful, love whomever, that would have been a nice note. But instead the note said, thank you very much, you gave us X, we so needed X because of Y, and because we had it, we were able to do Z, and there's a full story. You get a sense of real appreciation. And so when I would write my notes to associates, I was always, or I tried to be careful to say something specific about what they'd done, say something specific about them, their new job, whatever it was. That's what connects with people, and it gives us the examples that we want to follow, and it broadens the understanding. It broadens all of our understanding, and I love, one of my favorite quotes from Abraham Lincoln is, he is quoted as having said, I don't like that man. I need to get to know him better. And that need to get to know someone better is what happens through stories. And that's how we overcome, I don't like that person. And just pause and say, I need to get to know that person better. And that comes from connection and story.
We need more of that now. And especially over the holidays, since it's, a holiday podcast, generosity and goodness and joy are just what we sort of have to be living with right now, or what I think we should be.
All right, so I'm going to ask you two more practical questions, or how our audience can apply your knowledge to their lives. First question, storytelling. How do you think about it? What can people do? What can a normal person do who doesn't have your gifts at storytelling to hone that skill in their lives? First question. Then the second question, it's a more unusual question, but I am so fascinated by the fact that you're a voiceover artist. And I'm so curious as to how people use their voice as an instrument and what you notice that people are effective at, or how they could become more effective.
Well, I think the first one I'll tackle by saying that everyone's a storyteller, even though we don't believe we are, because we don't all tell universal stories. But if you come home and you tell your partner about your day, there's usually a beginning, a middle, and end. So you are telling a story. That being said, I think in order to tell universal stories, you have to you have to understand the art of storytelling. And I also think you have to be a good observer. So 2 tools. One is to start journaling. I think journaling in the morning is really helpful. It gets out a lot of insights that you've had from your life and just sort of like where you are right now. But also, I think if you can start writing about your days, then you'll start to notice that you're writing scenes and that you're picking up on different characters in your life and people that, like your boss who might chew his gum in a really obnoxious way. Like that, those things start to become prevalent and stand out to you. And those observations are what make you a good storyteller. I also would give another tool of just observation at the grocery store or at airports. Oh my gosh, airports are the best. I just put my phone away and I just watch people and I sort of make up stories in my head about who they are and what this relationship is. And I think letting your brain sort of go wild in that way, it adds to your imagination. It gives you this freedom that freedom of imagination is what you need to bring to the blank page so you can create. So I think those are 2 good tools, journaling and observation.
How much time do you spend journaling? So if you start the day journaling, I mean, I can't tell you the number of New Year's resolutions that I start by saying, I'm going to write a journal. And then, by February, I look back and maybe I did it twice. So how much time in a day do you spend doing that?
Well, I think if someone wants to start writing, it should probably be about, I don't know, do 3 pages, write 3 pages and then you'll continue to grow from there. But I can't give you an exact time because I don't know.
It's not a discipline that says I got to do this for a half hour.
No. Well, why do you want to journal? What's your reason?
Because I hear people like you say that it's a great idea to do. So I go, all right, this is something I got to try. And then, for whatever reason, the day overcomes me and I don't do it.
Well, I find it to be an easier form of meditation too. I mean, I can't just sit down and be quiet. So it helps me in that way. To answer your second question about voiceover. So, okay, In what context do you mean?
How does one even think about becoming a voiceover artist?
Well, I think the first thing is to approach scripts and copy, which a lot of them are just, you're selling things. Like I was the voice of Subway and Holiday Inn and, you're selling a night at the Holiday Inn. But if you think of it like a story, who are you speaking to? You're speaking to that family that is so excited to be going to Disney World and they're staying at the Holiday Inn and the kids have just been up for the whole week, so excited about this. And you're speaking to that family. Like that's who you're voicing this for. So I think having a directive of who you're speaking to is key. Then understanding the script and being able to understand sort of the intentionality behind what they're saying.
So sort of like people say about acting, it's getting behind the text and understanding who you're trying to reach by doing this.
That's right. That's right.
If you look at outside of Crazy Good Turns, which of course tells amazing stories that are positive for people, what are some other stories that have connected to you in a positive way?
Well, this time of year, I love all the Christmas films. Like, I know that sounds so silly and such an easy answer, but those bring me so much joy. And also, I think recently, as I mentioned earlier, Ted Lasso.
Which is such a positively spirited show.
Oh my gosh, it's all about generosity in its own way, too. I think we're sort of coming into a space where more of these, because of Ted Lasso's success, I think more of these shows are being created. I've noticed that more people are having more conversations about it. And even Tom Slick, which we could have sort of gone the Yeti, dark, dramatic route.
You could have gone dark, lost digit. Yeah.
Exactly. It's not that. It's really celebrating this man's life and who he was. And that celebration and also bringing integrity to his story. We're coming into more of an era of good stories, goodness stories, I guess you could say.
That's encouraging. That's excellent. So that leads to my general question to you. So who has done a crazy good turn for Carolyn Slaughter in your past?
I think Lynn Jackson, who introduced us, has done a really great crazy good turn for me. I've had a handful of people like this in my life who are just generous people that see something in you and believe in you and sort of support you in the next step. And I think I was in this place of sort of being in the true crime world of podcast and looking for the next step. And he was just such an influential person in that process. And yeah, I feel like I'm in a new place just mentally. So I'm really grateful to Glenn.
He is a wonderful person, and he is incredibly generous, as you say. And is there someone that you think goes, boy, but for Caroline Slaughter, she helped me so much. She did this for me, for whom you've done a crazy good turn?
I really try to support female storytellers and filmmakers. It's a big part of my life mission. And so I always, I try to give them guidance. I try to connect them to people, and I hire as many as I can. So that I hope a handful of people have said the same thing about me.
All right. So now you've got a lot of people out there who say, boy, I'd love Caroline's help. How would people follow you, learn what you're doing, reach out to you? What's the best way to get in touch with you?
My website is carolineslaughter.com, and that sort of updates people on what I'm doing. I'm not great at social media, but I'm at C Slaughters on Instagram. And I think, please feel free to reach out to me. I am going to be in a little bit of a crazy time with these upcoming podcasts, which thankfully I'm doing one for Headspace. And it's going to be a feel-good one. So I'm excited about that. But I will try to answer as many questions as I can and share insight on storytelling. And this has encouraged me to create a blog post about storytelling. So I'll have that up by this weekend.
I want to end with I think your comment about the impact of Ted Lasso and where things are going more generally towards stories about goodness. Do you think that's just a momentary trend, or this might sustain itself, or just the way this system works? There's always a tendency to revert back to what's the sensational.
I don't know, because I don't know what the trends are going to be. I think we're in such a weird time in general, and things are shifting so radically, so quickly. But I know for myself that I have an integrity as a storyteller, that I want to continue putting things out in the world that actually do add to the generosity and goodness. And that's all I can say is just sort of my own trajectory.
Final question. This, as you say, we're in the holiday season for this episode, and it's always struck me that part of the storytelling around the holiday season is about awe and people being awestruck by whatever it is, by something. So there's something that's just left you in awe, and what would that thing be?
I have 2 nephews and a niece, and the way they look at the world with this childlike wonder is just so contagious. And I think being able to look at things through their eyes when I'm with them, that brings me a sense of awe that I don't find in my everyday life all the time. I think I take things for granted, but when I'm with them, every little thing, even a donut, is just so exciting. And I recently watched E.T., which is my favorite film, with my niece. And I loved E.T. It's why I wanted to be a filmmaker. The way that I felt watching that as a kid, it just made me want to do it. But my niece was watching it, and to see her so engrossed in it and just having that reaction that I had when I was younger, that brought me a sense of awe.
Yeah, seeing things through a child's eye is maybe one of the best ways of experience being awestruck.
And for some reason, Christmas is that. I don't know if it's the films or what, but it brings you back to it's nostalgia. It brings you back to being a child again. Do you feel like that?
Absolutely, without a doubt. So, Caroline, this has been terrific. Thank you so much. And again, thank you for all the great advice and counsel you've given Crazy Good Turns. So what are the projects? You mentioned one project that you're working on, Tom Slick. Are there others that you want to give a mention to before this podcast ends?
Sure. I'm doing a podcast with Headspace called Hung Up, and it's about relationships. It's going to be really interesting and pretty fun. And that's coming out, I think, in April. And then Tom Slick should be coming out around that same time as well. So April 2022.
All right. Excellent. Thank you so much, Caroline.
Thanks, Frank.
I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Caroline Slaughter. And I'd like to end the show as I began with a request that you send in examples of crazy good things that have been done for you. So if there is a crazy good turn, someone did a kind deed for you, someone set a great example for you, please send your thoughts to us on Twitter or email them to us at hello@crazygoodturns.org. We'll share your stories in future episodes of the podcast. I'd like to close by thanking our excellent production team, Brian Sabin, Megan Hanlon, Stephen Key, and Score in Los Angeles. Without their help, this podcast would not exist. So we thank them very much and look forward to having you on our next podcast. Thanks.